All right. Welcome, everybody, to Finance Essentials with Danny Hudson. I am your host, Danny Hudson. I know you guys missed me last week. I was actually out of town for spring break. We finally managed to get my grandmother out of her long term care facility or whatever that she was basically imprisoned in for a year. I think she was able to see the sunlight one time, and so we wanted to be able to go down for spring break, help her get to hold her great grandkids, and get to spend some time with her. And so I didn't get a chance to do an episode last week. I actually kind of dropped the ball. A couple weeks ago, I had done a guest appearance on the Invictus Mind podcast. I was going to post that last week as kind of filler for you guys, so you got a little bit of Danny, because I know how you guys want that on a weekly basis, but I had forgot. So hopefully we didn't lose everybody. But let me start off by saying I really appreciate y'all being here. As we talk about in the past, if you guys get some value from the show, like, share it, subscribe, do all the fun stuff that they always spam on all the other podcasts. Follow us on social media. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, we're on YouTube. YouTube is always a good one because then you get to look at my pretty face for 30-40 minutes. If not, you get to listen to my beautiful voice for 30 to 40 minutes, but that's okay. We'll take either one of those. Also, too, related to that, I wanted to give you guys a little bit of a heads up. I am actually planning on no longer spending any marketing dollars on Facebook. So basically, the marketing budget for social media would be down to zero. So one of the things that I would ask of you guys is, again, if you get some value out of the show, share it, right? Because at this point, that's pretty much going to be the best way that the show is going to grow. I've had several people reach out and say, hey, this episode was really great. It's one of the best that I've heard related to such and such topic, which is always great and encouraging to hear. But again, since I've decided that, as I encourage, right, as something that we always encourage in a free market, is to choose to support specific companies with your dollar or your fiat currency, right? I think a lot of free market enthusiasts at this point are kind of referring to it as fiat currency, those gross fiat dollars. But I personally don't feel as though I should give them any more, and so I'm not going to do that. And so if you guys like the show, by all means, please feel free to share it because that's going to be the best way to do it. Also, too, I'm coming up with a prize for people who do so, who subscribe and share and that kind of thing. I've got some giveaways that I'm going to give because hey, who doesn't like free stuff, right? But hopefully it ties in with the show, and then you guys also appreciate it, and then you also get something out of it, because not only do we like to talk about on this show fun, and we like to talk about really learning topics and that kind of thing, but we like to also talk about a lot of very important topics that also tend to impact us on a day-to-day basis in our normal lives. One other idea I had, I didn't do it today. I was going to do it, but it didn't end up working out that way. But I thought I'd get some feedback from you guys. I was starting to do it. I'll just tell you what it is. Basically, what I thought about doing was kind of like a grab bag show. I saw a lot of good topics to go over, but I didn't see enough out of them to be able to devote a whole show. The one that we're doing today did turn out like that, but I saw a handful of other ones, whether it's legislation going through in Washington, or it's stimulus related, or infrastructure related, or how, what I mean? Like, I saw a handful of topics that I was thinking, well, I could probably do a few minutes on that, but I don't think I'm going to be able to do 30 to 35. And so if you guys think that would be kind of valuable to do like a grab bag episode where I just kind of do 3 to 5 minutes or whatever it might be on specific topics, and then we just address a handful of them in an episode. Let me know what you think, because I mean, I think that would be a pretty good idea, and I think that there are a lot of things that are pretty good that we could spend a few minutes on that don't necessarily need to warrant an entire episode. So give me your feedback. Let me know your thoughts on that. I think it's a good idea. Well, I guess if I like it and I think it's a good idea, then to be honest, what you guys end up saying probably won't matter that much. I'll probably end up doing it anyway. But I always like feedback from you guys. It's always good to hear. So if you have any thoughts on it, let me know. So diving into today's topic, I read something on Twitter the other day, and it kind of made me give it a second look. And it was a quote, and I don't know if it was a written quote or a verbal quote, but it was of former Democratic presidential nominee Andrew Yang, who some of you may be aware, a lot of you may not be aware, that he is looking to run for mayor of New York City. Now, I don't think it's that hard to understand that I'm not a big fan of Bill de Blasio, based off of the policies that he's done regarding lockdowns and so on and so forth. I think he's a pretty terrible person. So in that regard, I guess I wouldn't support Andrew Yang, but if I had a choice between the two, I would go with him. He does say quite a few things that I think make a lot of sense regarding competence of government, things that the government is good at, the people being able to know what's best for their own families regarding monetary purposes and that kind of thing. So he does say quite a few things that I do agree with. The implementation part I disagree with, but that's okay, right? Those are the types of conversations that we want to be having. We want to be able to have conversations with people that we disagree with. And so, he has plans like UBI that would be valuable in his mind. And I think it would be valuable for him to be the mayor of New York, implement a UBI in a place like New York, and then it would allow the rest of the country to really kind of view the positives, the negatives, how it really ends up working out. Personally, I think it would be a disaster. But hey, if the people vote for it, they vote the guy in, they support it. Hey, what am I going to say? If I have a problem, I just won't move to New York. But anyway, so his quote was referencing the New York City Department of Corrections data for 2020. And I won't get the quote exactly right, but he referenced to the fact that in fiscal year 2020, the New York City Department of Corrections spent $447,000 per inmate. And it was a third more than a year ago. So in 2019, they spent about $337,000 per inmate. And that was according to, a report that came out. And so I was like, ooh, that can't be right? Like, he has to have missed a decimal point or a comma or something, right? There is no way that New York City is spending almost $500,000 per inmate. It can't be, right? There's no possible way. Well, it is. It is. And not only did they go up almost $100,000 in a single year in cost per inmate, their inmate population has actually dropped. Their population dropped, violent crime in the prison, increased, and that kind of thing, which is also important. But the cost per inmate went up $100,000, and the population of the department in the prisons is actually only 5,800 inmates. There's 5,800 inmates that is in the New York City Correctional Facility system, down from 13,000-ish in 2010. So they've kind of, decreased by about 50% or so over the last decade. But my mind was just completely blown. Part of the reason of that is because I don't really know what it really costs to have an inmate in a prison, right? I just know that $500,000 sounds absolutely insane to me, and so I'm like, well, I gotta look into this. And so I thought it was super interesting, a super interesting fact. And so I kind of started to dive into the New York system and then kind of the system as a whole, right? Because I think a lot of people want criminal justice reform. I think that people understand the financial impacts of it. Whether it's people who are repeat offenders and they stay in the system cycle, right? As a lot of people would say. And so I wanted to look it up. I think also too that there are a lot of people who say, well, that private prisons are a big problem in the US. And of course it's going to cost $500,000 because these private prisons are leeching all of this money from the government and for taxpayers. But one of the things I found very interesting is that New York actually has no private prisons, right? So these are all government run facilities, which of course the other half of the audience is like, well, that makes perfect sense that the government would be the ones that are spending $500,000 per inmate in a single year. So I thought that was really interesting, and so I was like, well, if New York doesn't have private prisons, what does the private prison makeup look like in the U.S.? Because if you spend too much time on social media, which is probably a lot of people, you probably see people complaining about private prisons and how they should be ending and so on and so forth. But only about 31 states actually have private prisons. So if you do the math, then that would mean that 19 do not. And then out of the 31 states, about 116,000 inmates are in those private prisons in 2020. And so it's that number of the 116,000, it's up about 33% since 2000, but it actually peaked in 2012 and it's been coming back down since then. So if you think about it, right, we're talking about 31 states that have 116,000 inmates, but for the entire system, the entire incarceration system, the jail system as a whole, it's only about 9%. Only about 9% of the prisoners that are in the United States are actually held in private prisons, which was a big surprise to me, mainly because, again, when people talk about private prisons being an issue, you tend to think, well, they're an issue because they're too big, they're too powerful, whatever the other conditions might be, you tend to think that they hold a lot more pull than they actually do. And only two states, it was Montana and New Mexico, actually have inmate percentages in their states that are over 30%. So if you think about it that way, only two states have about a third of their prison population that's held in private prisons. Now keep in mind too that also doesn't say a whole lot. Like, so for example, some of the other statistics that you might read, it's saying, but in the last decade or 2 decades, the Arizona private prison population has grown 400%. But then when you look at the numbers, and I don't remember these specifically offhand, but they went from 100 to like 500. So it's not quite as big of a deal as most people would kind of make it think, right? It's kind of like if you pick up the paper, or I guess people don't pick up the paper anymore, but you pull up at whatever news site, right, and it talks about Louisiana crimes against poodles in 2019 rose 500%, and then you look at the number and it went from like 1 to 5. Now, no one should be beating up poodles because they're cute puppies and stuff like that, but the percentages is kind of what gets the reaction, and so it's worth looking into the actual numbers that are there. So at the same time, 31 states, right, and only 2 have a higher population percentage of 30%. That means 29 states have less than a third of their prison population that is actually in private prisons. Texas has the most, which is about 12,500. So if you think about it in terms of that versus the 116, Texas has about 10% or so of the total private prison population. And so also too, some of the other prison statistics and incarceration statistics that seem to make sense based off of populations. If you look at the total system, Texas leads with about 150,000 inmates, and then California and Florida are a bit behind Texas. Again, right? They're higher population states, so that kind of makes sense. And then Louisiana, Oklahoma, and Mississippi are the highest by average in terms of per 100,000, per capita kind of thing. And so what I started to do was I started to dig into, and I was like, all right, well, $450,000 is insane, right? Because again, these are taxpayers, right? These are you guys that are paying. And so I was like, well, that has to be the most expensive, right? The New York City. So to add a little perspective, New York State costs about 70,000. It's the highest state in the U.S. It's about 70,000, which to be honest, New York City is probably pulling that number up some. If you go elsewhere, you're probably not quite living in the prison luxury that you are in New York City. But it comes in first at about 70,000. But then one of the ones that I came across that was super interesting. Well, in California and Connecticut weren't too far behind New York. They were like 65K. But the number that I thought was super fascinating was Guantanamo Bay. I was really happy that I'm not happy that Guantanamo Bay exists, but I was happy that I was able to find cost for per inmate for Guantanamo Bay, because a lot of people know the existence of Guantanamo Bay, but they don't really understand a lot about it. Guantanamo Bay is essentially an offshore prison that's in Cuba, where people, I don't want to go down the political route too much, but essentially they're generally tend to be what the government would call enemy combatants, whatever category they fall into, or things along those lines, and they're held there mainly because they claim that they do not feel comfortable having them kind of in the continental U.S. Unfortunately, they also can tend to hold people there indefinitely without trial and that kind of thing. But the part that I thought was super fascinating was it costs about $900,000 a year per inmate in Guantanamo Bay. So when my mind was blown from New York City at $450,000 a year per inmate, the Guantanamo Bay number, was absolutely. I mean, you're talking about almost $1 million a year to keep somebody locked in a cage for 23 hours a day. Now, again, not talking about the humanity aspect of it and that kind of thing, but just the sheer cost. I mean, $1 million a year, to house these guys, which is absolutely insane. And I think that's a number and something that people should be aware of, right? I mean, we're spending millions and millions of dollars a year to house these guys, down there, and which is absolutely crazy to me. And then, of course, on the opposite side, you've got your guys that are low, right? They're low on the cost. So your Alabama is about 15,000. Kentucky is about 17,000. What I would really be curious about, and maybe some of you guys out there listening know this better than me, I would be really curious about the amenities at a $70,000 a year New York facility and a $15,000 a year facility in Alabama. I don't think that they would be a lot different, but maybe, at the 70,000 one in New York, maybe you get cheeseburgers for lunch, and then in Alabama you get gruel. I don't know. I don't know what it might be, but there's a huge disparity there, and my guess is that there's a lot of regulation and red tape and that kind of thing that goes into it. I know there's healthcare costs, obviously food costs, board costs. There's a lot of additional costs that go into it, in terms of standard inmate costs. But then I think, too, one of the other facets that's pretty interesting about the American prison system is a lot of people understand, they say, well, we know that the U.S. has the most incarcerated people in the world. The U.S. holds, I believe it's about 25% of the total world's incarcerated population. And so for every 100,000 people that live in the U.S., about 65 or 650 of them are in prison. And so to add some perspective, El Salvador is second at 600, Turkmenistan is third at 550. So you just go to third and you're already talking about a pretty significant difference. I mean, you're talking about 100 people per capita per 100,000, and just going from first to third. And I mean, look at the company that we're with, right? I mean, no offense to the listeners from El Salvador and Turkmenistan, but when we're talking about the land of the free, and yet we are blowing you guys out of the water in terms of the incarcerated population. I mean, there's some issues there. There's some things in there that we should probably revisit. One of which is the nonviolent drug offenses, right? So approximately 1 out of 5 people that's currently in our prison system is there for a nonviolent drug offense. Whether it's selling, I believe most of the time it probably wouldn't necessarily be for possession. I would imagine possession is probably lower on there, but they exist. Especially in a society where we believe in, the 3-strike rule, or, whatever else it might be to get them there. But it could also be trafficking, things along those lines. One of the things that I came across, and I don't necessarily know the validity of it, I'm sure probably somebody out there that's listening that might know it a little bit better, are people who had other charges, but then they plead down, so they will say somebody goes to trial and they committed armed robbery or, whatever those were, but then they also had drug charges tacked on. They'll say, well, we will plead guilty to, A, B, and C if you dismiss D, E, and F. So while it does say that 1 in 5 are in there for nonviolent drug offenses, I don't have the data on who pleaded down to understand out of that 20%, how many people were charged with something greater. Now, that being said, you still are put in a position where even though those were, violent or whatever those charges might have been, they were still drug related. So the position there would be is that if in a society where they're not illegal, you could essentially remove the black market, unless you're California, where you decide to throw a 30% or a 40% tax on marijuana, and it's still cheaper to buy from, your local dealer down the road. But in theory, you would eliminate the black market, which would also potentially help, alleviate a lot of the violence that typically tends to coincide with some of the drug offenses as well. Another big key factor, I don't know if a lot of you out there are very familiar with like the cash bail system. The cash bail system has been something that's really been hotly debated, over the last few years. Essentially what it does is the bail system is, you get arrested for whatever reason, you haven't been sentenced, you haven't been convicted, it requires a certain amount of money for you to be out, and then you would await your trial outside of the system. But the problem there ends up being is that a lot of people end up in those situations and they don't have the money, right? So that's why a lot of people are saying, well, in the cash bail system, because what you're doing is you're essentially locking up poor people who don't have the ability, to be able to get out. So one of the things that I thought was very interesting was that over 550,000 people are held without being convicted because they can't afford the bail. So median bail for a felony is about $10,000. Now again, I don't know the breakup as far as what those felony charges are. I'm sure people listening would say, well, if it was something like where he beat up an old lady and he took her purse and now he's sitting in prison. Well, maybe I don't, and that's a felony because she had $1,000 or whatever the charge might be. Maybe I don't want him out on the street, because why would we want him out? So I understand that. And I also don't necessarily understand what the requirements are for that. Because if we think about averages, right, that means you probably have some averages that are $1,000, but then, or some bails that are $1,000, but then you also have some other ones that are probably like $100,000. whatever those conditions might be. But the average comes in at about 10, which again, a significant portion of people do not have necessarily the ability to be able to afford. So the number that I thought was super interesting was, as we were talking about 550,000 people. So over the span of this system, over 500,000 people are basically sitting, in a cage. And even though they haven't been convicted of anything and they haven't been sentenced to anything, they just can't afford to get out. So I thought that was super interesting. Another part too that I thought, and I'm sure most of you guys are probably aware of people who have been in this situation before, and it tends to be very unfortunate, generally speaking. But in 2016, about 170,000 people were incarcerated due to technical violations, which is basically means violation of their parole or their probation, right? So an example of that might be, you're out on probation and you are not allowed to leave the city or the state, or you are only allowed to drive to and from work, right? And you get picked up and you were actually driving over to a friend's house because maybe he has cable and you don't, and you wanted to watch the football game or whatever it might be. You were speeding, you get picked up. Now you're violating your probation, and therefore you're going, you would go back to the clink. So that number was super interesting to me. 170,000 people that were basically there because they violated some terms of agreement or whatever it might be with the Justice Department. And so one of the things that this rolls up to is the justice system as a whole, right? So the U.S. justice system controls about 8 million people, over half of which are out on probation. And so what I mean by control is that they are responsible for where you are, what you're doing. You have to report to them. You have to if you're in the system, right, they're feeding you, they're clothing you. If you're out, they're monitoring a lot of things that you're doing. You have to check in with them pretty frequently. And so there's this entire system, in a country of 330-ish million people. We'll assume, how many would that be? Probably 250, we'll say 240-ish million working age. So 8 million into 240 million would be what, 3% ish? I don't know. If I'm way off, I'll just correct this, when I put it out there, and none of you guys will know the wiser. But we'll just say, it's still a small percentage as a whole, but that's a lot of people, right? That literally they are controlling the day-to-day lives of, which is pretty interesting. And in my opinion, I think that's a system that definitely needs to be overhauled. And one of the things too that we've talked about before on this show, I know we talked about some when we did the episode regarding the American Rescue Plan, right? Is the idea of having a big COVID, the COVID industrial complex, as I'm sure some people will probably refer to it as, where you have these large companies that are basically lobbying to keep getting government contracts and keep getting money, and so on and so forth. A lot of people will make references to Big Pharma. Big Pharma is the same way. People make references to the NRA and their annual lobbying budgets and that kind of thing. But the NRA is, if you had a table with the big lobbyists, the NRA wouldn't even be allowed in the room, right? Because the amount of money that they spend lobbying in Washington is nothing. Again, they wouldn't even be invited to come and hang out at the table because of what they do is small potatoes compared to Big Pharma, and then obviously the unions are also way up there, but Big Pharma, and I believe insurance lobbies, and the military industrial complex, right? So a lot of your big defense contractors are also up there, and these are the guys that literally spend, when we talk about $1 billion spent on lobbying, those are the guys that are spending several $100 million. But the prison industrial complex is also, it also exists. I looked these numbers up, and according to USA Facts, there's about 120,000 people that work in the Department of Justice, right? So these are your DEAs, these are your FBIs, these are your ATFs, those guys, right? So you're talking about 120,000 people of whose job essentially relies on prohibition of these things and enforcement of, these rules and these laws and things that you've set in place to keep, again, approximately 8 million people or so in control at any given time. But then there's also about 1 million people across the country that work in law enforcement. Now, I believe that number does not include just officers, right? Your street patrol guys. I believe that also includes your office workers, and I believe that also includes, other people who work within the policing system, but they aren't necessarily directly related to enforcement. And so all in all, when you're looking at this, I mean, you're talking about like close to 1.2 million people who essentially, not to say that on an individual basis they are, but as a group, they have an incentive for this system to kind of perpetuate itself, right? Because their jobs, their livelihoods, their families depend on this system and their funding, and that kind of thing. And so they also have somewhat of a vested interest into making sure that the system kind of continues. And the final thing too that I thought was super interesting, again, I wasn't sure about a lot of this stuff, right? A lot of this information is new to me. I knew that private prisons weren't a large percentage of the system as a whole, but I didn't know exactly how much. But the majority of this is very new information to me, and I'm really glad that Andrew Yang said this thing, because I was like, I'm not very familiar with that. Maybe I need to go dive down the rabbit hole. But the last statistic that I thought was very interesting was related to the amount of money for the prison system as a whole that is spent every year, again, enforcement and that kind of thing. And it's about $74 billion. About $74 billion per year is spent on this system. I understand that it's hard to conceptualize what $74 billion looks and feels like and that kind of thing. But to add some perspective to it, $74 billion is higher than the total annual GDP of 133 countries in this world. So think about our enforcement costs more than 133 countries in this world produce annually in GDP. Now, whether or not we believe that GDP is an accurate measurement, that's kind of irrelevant for this conversation. But the fact that it costs more than 133 countries GDP is pretty astounding. And also too, to add some additional perspective, if that was all total included in terms of a federal department, it would be sixth in total expenditures at a federal level, right? And so only 5 federal departments would actually rank higher than that. And I think it was Health and Human Services was there, and then I think it was Social Security was there, and then after that it was like Department of Homeland Security was there, which we all know how worth, their $200 billion or whatever it is they get a year, they totally earn that. And then the Department of Education was also there. And if you're tuning in and you're from that 5th department that I forgot, I'm sorry, I forgot you guys. But yeah, so the total enforcement system would be about 6th as a federal department, which again is just a crazy amount of money, right? And all of this comes from you guys. You guys go to work and you work hard and you pay taxes and you do all that kind of thing. And about 74 billion of that a year goes into these enforcement agencies. Now, again, a lot of you out there might go, well, you know what? Out of everything that the government spends, I'm not as concerned about this one, and that's all right. But again, the numbers I think are very important, and I think it's very important for people to be aware of this type of information. For one, because it makes us all smarter, right? And I don't think anybody would ever complain about knowing too much. And so I thought this topic was very interesting, and I wanted to share it with you guys because Again, I like interesting things. I hope you guys do. I hope you guys learn something. And if you guys got some good value, like I mentioned at the beginning of the show, share it. At this point, you guys are basically the best way of helping the show grow. And keep encouraging me. I get a lot of great feedback from you guys. I know we're growing every week. Just looking from this past week or so versus when we first started, things are looking great. It's looking really positive. Again, the feedback is always great, and I super appreciate that. So again, share the show, subscribe, do all that fun stuff. Follow us on social media. That's always a fun time as well. And if you guys happen to have any additional show or feedback ideas, let me know. All right. But enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll talk again soon. All right. Bye.